Hello and welcome to Psychology in the Wild, the podcast where we try to make sense of the chaos of everyday life. I'm Dr. Gemma Lee Roberts.
And I am Erin Trimpton.
Erin, what has been wild this week for you?
Well, this week has been wild. So I had some minor surgery last week, which I might go into again, but I won't go into the ins and outs of it for this story. But just suffice to say that the recovery from the surgery was a lot more intense than I expected. So, which was fine. I had thankfully planned to take a few days off work and, find some nice Netflix to watch, i.e. Martha Stewart, which you recommended, which was amazing, by the way. We should discuss that again.
Mm-hmm. We could do a whole episode on that.
That's a whole another episode. But suddenly it turned out that, it wasn't suddenly because we knew it was happening, but my husband was going away for work this week. And it was just one of those oversights of planning where I agreed to do the surgery and we completely forgot that he was actually going to be away for the whole following week. And it wasn't ideal because I still was not fully recovered. And I have 2 children and work to manage and all of that. So I got through it though. And just to say, obviously, I'm no martyr. I got through it with help of my family who came and helped out. All of my family came and helped out on Sunday. And then I have a fantastic childminder who's been really helpful this week as well. But nonetheless, you know yourself as a mother, you're still the chief operating officer of the household. So there's still stuff that needs to be done. It's really obviated to me just how much and how many times I actually bend down in a day to pick stuff up off the floor. Anyway, so I've been instead going around barking orders about what needs to be picked up and put in various different locations. So that's been interesting. But actually, it's really interesting because I was obviously dreading it, thinking how am I going to manage this? But actually, it's all gone by and large totally fine. And it even got to the point where one of the nights I ended up getting one of my children to put the other one to bed. And I was just thinking, I think I might have arrived when it comes to parenting. Now,
that sounds like a life goal.
There was bribery involved. Again, no martyrdom here. There was bribery involved. But yeah, it just sort of felt like, and so I suppose my point of reference is my husband, Dan, travels a lot for work and my eldest is nearly 10 now. So ever since he was a baby, we've always had a kind of routine in our household where he is away a lot. And obviously that used to be particularly hard when I had 2 small children. And, actually a good friend of mine would refer to those times, when you're kind of solo parenting or something's going on with the kids, like one of them sick or whatever, as, you're in the trenches. And I always quite like that because it's like, you get that feeling of like, I'm in the trenches. You kind of know that the trenches are temporary, but, you're in survival mode, basically.
Yeah.
And I feel like, this kind of ties nicely to some of the stuff we've already talked about with resilience, because I feel like this week wasn't as bad as it might have been because I have already kind of set myself up, and because I've experienced the challenge before, I kind of knew exactly what I needed to do to get through the week. I'm not saying I would have chosen, although, all throughout the years to be in the trenches, and I'm not saying I would have chosen to be in the trenches this week. It was definitely an oversight of planning, but I have to say that definitely it did lead me to making kind of better decisions about how to manage it. So, yeah.
I think your week brings us quite nicely onto the topic that I would love to talk about, mostly because
Yes.
I'm hoping this is going to be a therapy session for me and you're going to have all the answers. Boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
Setting boundaries. Now, this could be boundaries in so many different ways, and it's such a big conversation. But I'm kind of thinking in terms of, well, roles that we've got in our life. So it could be work and parenting, it could be work and caring, it could be studying and parenting, studying and, being connected to people that you care about or for a support system, but kind of like these boundaries between different parts of our lives. And that is going
Yeah.
to look very individual for everyone.
That's exactly it. Yep.
Where do we even start? It's such
Well,
a hot topic.
and it is such a vast, enormous topic, and it's what enormous topic. It's one of those things as well that it's getting bandied around now loads, and I'm not totally sure we all understand what we mean, because there's lots of different types of boundaries as well.
So, should I give you my definition of boundaries? So, a boundary, let's think about a boundary. A boundary is an imaginary line with a very real function, and that is to protect your time, your energy, and that can be mental, physical, emotional, and your focus. So, if you think about how you want to protect all of those very important resources in your life, your time, your energy, and your focus, what is the line that you want to put around them? And that helps you to be more productive, helps you to be more well, to be more engaged in what you're doing. And that is probably the simplest way I can describe a boundary, although obviously there are loads of different types of boundaries. So I think for the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're talking about the boundaries mainly between work and home, or the boundary that exists between the different types of demands that we have in our lives. We could also go into interpersonal boundaries, which is a whole different, it's a related topic, but it's different because it's more to do with the behavior that you tolerate in others. So I think we're probably not going to cover that
Quite well here. What do you think? So you mentioned you have maybe a particular issue that you've been facing, or is there? I mean, this is something that we all face every day, right?
Yeah. And I think some days are obviously better than others, and some weeks are better than others. I live a really strange life in terms of boundaries. And actually, I had a bit of a interesting exchange with one of my friends on LinkedIn. Was it last week or the week before? Dr. Hayley Lewis, who creates these sketch notes on LinkedIn. She created one around boundaries. And I was like, this is amazing. Like different kinds of boundaries you might have. And she put a comment saying, that's great, because something along the lines of, I think of you as someone who does boundaries really well. And I was like, really? Because I don't see that. Like, and then it really got me thinking around what I am like with boundaries. And I was thinking, actually, no, sometimes I am really good with boundaries and setting boundaries and sticking to them. Not always the community. I think I fall down the communication part, so we'll come to that bit in a bit.
Yeah,
that's
but hard though.
Like it's hard, and I forget other people don't know what's in my head.
That's exactly the issue with it.
Oh, I need to work on that for sure, and I am trying to get better. But there's some boundaries I'm really not great at. Like I'm not great at. I don't really like confrontation or something that feels like it could be conflict. Or so if I'm not happy with how something is going, I sometimes find that quite hard to, put a boundary around and say, like, that's not how I want that time to be, or that's not how I want to spend my energy. Like I can find that quite challenging sometimes. But also I live a really weird life, as you know, in terms of
on many
just
levels.
in general, on many levels, many levels. In terms of work and parenting and all the other things I've got going on in life.
You don't live a life that is a traditional approach to work.
I don't, and I sometimes
lots
feel
of people
like,
don't anymore, but you were doing that for a long time.
Yeah. And I sometimes feel like perhaps it was easier when, in terms of boundaries, and that's all I'm talking about. I'm talking about life in general. But, if I think back to days where, since I've had children, I've never had to commute 5 days a week. I haven't really had a normal job. It's been consulting. It was consulting originally when I first had kids. But prior to that, when I first started my career and I was working in the city, living on the outskirts of London at the time, commuting in 5 days a week, like hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes each way, which was tough, but then, I'd go out after work. Sometimes you get the social aspect and that's just what you had to do. If you wanted to earn the money that you could earn in the city, which was more than anywhere else in London, I'm talking about, that's what you had to do. Everyone was commuting like that. And I sometimes feel like, obviously I wouldn't want to go back to that life, but and so we're talking a long time ago as well. So let's, that's part of this, but I never used to have my BlackBerry on the weekends. This is BlackBerry days. I
Mm.
never used to reply to stuff in the evenings. And fair enough, I wasn't that senior, obviously starting my career, so I probably didn't have those same expectations. Whereas now, I compare that to my life now, where I work from home most of the time.
Mhm.
The children, I'm trying to work in term times. So I saw someone today
Yeah.
actually, and he was like, "Oh, how's this quarter going?" I said, "I don't work in quarters, I work in terms." Because I
Yeah.
take so much of the holidays off. And our terms in the UK, oh my gosh,
Mm.
I mean, my children have 18 weeks a year off. It's unreal,
Mm.
unreal, and unnecessary. Anyway, that's for another podcast. Um, I had this really weird life where, they see me work and sometimes I'm filming at home. Sometimes they're kind of coming in from school and I'm wrapping up filming so anyway, so I had this in half term. I was really, really, so they had 2 weeks off in October half term. And I was really organised in that the girls were going to stay with my husband's mum, so his mum and stepdad for, I think they were going down, they live by the coast. They were going down, I think, for 4 days. Yeah, 4 days, I think. So I planned my 2 weeks worth of work because we were going away the second week. So I planned the first week, like 2 weeks of what I needed to get through in this 3 days.
Mm.
And then Jake's mum got shingles and couldn't have the girls. So it was really, like,
Ooh, no.
really poorly, which is horrific. So it meant, like, my work-life blend just became a whole lot more blended. So even though Jake was fun and he had to pick up quite a lot of that and trying to figure out stuff to do with the kids, even, I was then doing work, like stuff with the kids instead of doing work, and I sometimes find it really hard to do like really deep thinking stuff. So I plan that for when they're out. I plan that for when they're at school.
Yeah, because your
Um,
brain is literally divided.
yeah.
Even when the kids are not necessarily even, it's not necessarily always about kids, obviously. It's like any other demand that's on you. When that is present in your immediate vicinity, it's impossible not, like, I even find that's why, I have to get out of the house to go and do some deep thinking work, because I'll still be thinking about the laundry, or I'll be focusing on, the fact that the skirting boards need to be cleaned, because it's impossible to just remove that all from your head unless you move away from it. And so I can completely understand that, where even if the kids are being cared for, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still front of mind.
100%. And that's what I find really hard. I find it really hard
Yeah.
switching between those kind of demands. I find that,
Yeah.
and I'm sure lots of people feel the same. And there could be all kinds of ways that that's expressed. But I guess my question around that is because I feel like you know a lot more because your research was on this, wasn't it?
Yeah, I did both of my undergrad and my master's dissertation research on the idea of boundaries, work life balance, or blend, which, yeah, we prefer to say, and boundaries. Yeah.
So my question is 2 questions actually. One, do some people like their boundaries between, we're talking home and life here, but between 2 things? Do some people like it more structured than others? And my
Yep.
second question is, if they do have a preference, does that preference come out at different points in time? So it might be like, this week I want it more like this, and next week I want it more like that. Or is it once we've got our preference, that kind of is how we like to live
It's
if we have a
stable.
choice? Yeah.
Okay, so I can definitely answer the first one. The second one, I think, probably is interesting, isn't it? Because we've changed so much the way we work over the last few years, that I think there is huge scope for loads more research on that. So I'll come back to that. But the first one is yes. So there is lots of research, and there's a theory in psychology which is called boundary theory. And it says that if you think about a scale, that we with like fully segmented work and home life on one end, and blended work on the other, or blended work and home life on the other end. It's like we all have different preferences for the way we like to segment and integrate our work and home lives. So, you might be what they'd call a segmenter, which means that you like to leave work at work and keep home at home. And if you think about it, if you have that preference and your working life is set up to meet that preference, as in you leave at the same time every day and you go into an office where all you do is work in that office and you don't think about home stuff, and then you come home and then when you're at home all you do is your home stuff, then if your working life is set up to meet that preference, then well-being and engagement outcomes are more likely. So that's what all the research says on that. Whereas if you are an integrator, where you don't mind, and there are definitely people who are like this, don't mind being on Zoom while also sticking cartoons on for the kids and sticking something on in the slow cooker for dinner, and you're grand with that, and your work life is set up to meet that. Again, you're more likely to thrive in that scenario. So there's loads of research to show that. However, all of that research was done well before the COVID pandemic. So like I was looking at this, back in the early 2000s. And at that time, the idea that people could be working from home en masse was completely outlandish, to be honest. So we are now in a situation where the tables have turned completely, in that a lot of knowledge workers and a lot of people who can, there's obviously a lot of jobs where you just cannot work from home and cannot work remotely, and those jobs are still very boundaried. But loads of us are trying to do two things at once all the time at the moment. A lot of people, and myself included, might say on a Friday afternoon, I've still got to do work, but I also need to do play dates for my children, so I'll try and do both. And while on paper that seems like a good idea, if you are not a person who kind of is okay with blending those two worlds, that's going to be actually quite stressful. So I suppose the first thing to think about is, do I prefer those boundaries, that that imaginary line? Do I prefer it to be really, really hard, or do I mind if it's a bit porous? And I think what's probably emerged as well is probably no one week is the same on that. There are very few of us now who are living a life that is completely boundaried in terms of work and life. And so it can be hard to say, actually, one week I might be okay with, work and life blending all together. And then another week, it probably depends on the type of work you're trying to do. Because if you think about, if you're really trying to get into that focused type of work that you were talking about, it'll depend on that. Whereas if you're kind of just tipping along and tipping away doing admin tasks or something, it might be all right to have the kids on in the background. The kids on. Like you can turn them on.
Oh, the kids are always on.
Yeah, they're always on. Unless they're asleep. And even when they're asleep, sometimes
they're still sometimes on.
Yeah. So it's complex, but I think the first thing to work out is actually, which I think you already kind of have. I think you've identified, look, you do need boundaries. You need a hard line between work and home, especially around certain tasks, especially around certain thinking tasks that you need to do. And the other thing is then, like you mentioned it earlier, is once you've worked out, where do I sit on this kind of scale, you need to be able to communicate with people where your boundaries are. And I think that's a really hard one as well, because I think often what happens is, there's certain things that you'll know, right? So if you are a parent and you have to do a school drop, that you are not going to be able to make a meeting in an office until 9:30 or whatever it is after school drop time. So that's a kind of an easy to understand and an easy one to communicate. But there are other things that crop up in a day-to-day basis, and you'll only know when you're asked to do something if that jars with you or not. So it can be quite hard. So I would say the other thing is to not be, because there's so much noise around boundaries, don't be hard on yourself either if you haven't worked them all out. It's just trial and error, really. You just have to work out, okay, that sits well with me, that doesn't sit well with me. And each week as you go by, kind of come up with your routine that actually, okay, this fits for me. Because people are still working out, the hybrid. We're still having ridiculous mandates coming out from some of the big multinationals of, getting people back to the office full time and 5 days a week. So that's still happening.
Mhm.
and we're in
I just can't imagine.
2024.
I know.
I,
I
you
can't
know,
imagine.
so there are still, there's still, the world of work still hasn't settled down post-pandemic. We still are trying to experiment with what works best for people. I think by and large, when I speak to people, by and large, everybody kind of agrees hybrid works best for them, because you can still
Mhm.
because that's where you get the 2 or 3 days maybe in an office and you get your social connection, you get to see people and work together, but then you also get that boundary time at home where you can, or wherever else you need to be to focus and you're not, interrupted by colleagues. Although actually in reality you usually are because you're also on Zoom most of the day. But anyway. Um
So it's
so
this communication part.
yes, that's
I
what I was
mean,
gonna.
how do we even communicate it? Because I would probably never say the words, "These are my boundaries. This
No,
is." I
me
guess
too. Never.
it's I don't think I've ever used the word boundary other than to try and teach my children what a boundary is. I might have used it in that context at some point. Although they have like zero boundaries with me, by the way. I'll be doing something and they'll be on me or floating round or yeah, hi. Same with the dog who's currently sitting on my feet. He definitely doesn't understand
Yeah.
boundaries.
Dogs don't understand boundaries. I mean,
I mean,
yeah.
that's but one of our biggest issues. He's lovely, but that is my biggest issue. Um, so how? I guess okay. So we can think about like what works for me in terms of I'm thinking about someone like coming into this first time they've thought about it. Identifying your boundaries. Some of it is trial and error. Some of it is testing stuff. And I guess
Mhm.
if something happens where you feel like you've been stretched because it's energy, focus, and time. Sorry, that's one way
Yeah.
around. Time, energy, focus.
Yeah.
Um, So if you feel like something is being stretched too far somewhere, so it's requiring too much of your time or too much of your energy or too much
Yeah.
of your focus, whether that be in general or at a particular point in time where you think actually that doesn't work at that point in time. So, I don't know, 8 p.m. in the evening or early morning.
Mhm.
I guess it's noticing that
Yes.
because that stuff can make you quite annoyed. It's probably how I'd experience. That's the emotion that I would probably experience in those
Mm.
situations. But then I sometimes get a bit annoyed at myself as well. I can get annoyed at the situation and I get annoyed at myself for kind of letting that happen. But that's not actually that helpful. Well, emotions a data point. I mean, it's helpful to tell me that I'm annoyed, but in terms of like what I then do with that, I guess reflecting on that doesn't feel great. It might not sit with my values.
Yeah.
It may not sit with how I want to live my life or,
Yep.
how I see my time going. So I guess then the point is, what do you then do about that? So then you, as much as you can, because we're all restricted in, I don't know anyone that has a completely free life that can wake up every morning and do exactly what they want. So we will all have some kind of restriction. I'm sure those people
Yeah.
do exist. It's like that. It's like Hugh Grant in About a Boy. I don't
Oh
actually know
yeah.
anyone who has that life, but obviously it does exist. Um,
Watching
so I guess,
Countdown.
yeah, in 20-minute increments, isn't he?
Yeah, I love
He
it.
spends his day. So you're reflecting that this doesn't feel great, or this does feel really great. Like I really nailed that. I like how that went. Then I guess is looking at like the next week or the next month or the next whenever you can
Yeah.
start to make changes and think like how could I set this up differently? Like what would look good for me? And it might be changing one small thing or a couple
Yes.
of things. Give that a go, test that, see if it works. But this is the stage we're at now. We're talking about is how do we then tell other people that's what we're doing?
So I probably have three main tips on this, and the last one will maybe solve for that issue. But so firstly, try and be so assuming that you've kind of done as much reflection as you possibly can. And again, nobody's going to know, it's not like we all have our boundaries written up on the wall somewhere going, this is what I will tolerate and this is what I will not tolerate. It's all in your head, really, isn't it?
It
So
is.
once you're sort of establishing and testing out, as you say, that routine that you think works for you, then you have to communicate it. And the first thing is to be specific, like really specific. Like, 'cause I remember the first, I used to get really annoyed years ago. I'd get annoyed with people inviting me to meetings at times outside of, my working hours or whatever. And I then realized, well, sure, I haven't told them that I can't do that time. I've never expressed that time doesn't suit me for whatever reason. This was pre-kids, but obviously outside of kids, I mean, we are in the thick of it with children and raising kids at the moment, and that's obviously a big demand. But there's also, it has to be said, there's so many other things outside of our lives, or of our working lives, that are very reasonable demands that we should be paying attention to, or not just demands, things that we want to do that are
100%.
outside of work, and that are completely, it's completely acceptable to say to an employer, I need to leave at this time tonight because I'm going to my Pilates class. It's
100%.
outside of working hours, and it's totally fine. Anyway, so what I would say is be as specific as possible, because it's no good sort of saying to your team or your colleagues, like, I'm a working parent, so therefore I'll have to go. I have to pick my kids up from school. They're like, first of all, people don't know what time that is. They don't know what, people don't have the capacity in their minds to really get into your routine, basically. So I would say the first thing to say is, if a meeting continues to crop up that doesn't really work for you, say, actually on a Wednesday, I do the school drop, so I'll never be able to get into the office until 9:30. And then the second thing is to always give solutions. So once you've given that, because I think that can sometimes be a bit of a kind of a conflict point, because where, people think they need to communicate their boundaries, but once they've communicated them, they don't then give a solution for something that they can't manage. And so in this example, for, maybe it's, I can't take a phone call I won't be checking my Slack messages after 6 p.m. But if you really need me, give me a call. Or, I can't make the meeting at that certain time, but I can do this time and that time and that time. So I just think it's very important to follow up. Once you're specific about where your boundaries are in terms of the time you can make, or whatever it is, the focus you want to give, or the energy that you have to give, make sure that you're also giving a solution for an alternative. But then the last thing I think is kind of more macro. What we probably, the solution that I would always recommend, and it's really boring to be honest, but it's it does
They're the
work.
best.
Yeah, I know, aren't they? Is, especially in a team context, is again, not to sit down with your colleagues and talk about your boundaries, because who wants to do that? Like, who wants to sit down in a meeting room together and talk about, or on a Zoom call and talk about our boundaries? Like, nobody wants to do that. However, what you can do is sit down together and talk about your ways of working with each other, and talk about, okay, this is how we operate as a team. And within that, this is our routine as a team. And like, talk through each of your working preferences, think about things like your working styles. All of those things are great topics of discussion for kind of improving communication and culture on a team, but also to get to this point where everybody understands, okay, we all do have these different working preferences. We all have different demands outside of our working lives. And kind of you get to a point of mapping out a bit of a routine that works for everyone without actually having to say, these are my boundaries and this is what I won't tolerate, And then, of course, a kind of an add-on to that is, we obviously all have to accept that there'll have to be a compromise no matter what. If you work in a team, if you work with other people, no matter what you do, you will always have to compromise, because there's not going to be a situation that will fit for everyone. But as long as you are, as a team, and if you lead a team in particular, make sure the team is open to continuing to experiment with that routine. As you said earlier, it's just testing and adapting each week. And that's, and I know we say this a lot, but it is like, if you think about the way the working world used to be, we used to just get up, go into an office, get it there at a certain time, have our meetings. And I know I'm oversimplifying this, but, leave and come home. And we didn't have to think about it. There was no testing and adapting, because that was just how it was. There was a framework and we all did it.
Yep.
The working world is different. And the quid pro quo that comes with the flexibility that we get with the working world as it is now is that we have to test and adapt to make sure that it's working for everyone. So that's probably one last thing actually is that I, again, this is kind of something I'd recommend with culture stuff and with, building psychological safety on teams. When there's a tricky topic like boundaries, it's quite nice to try and come up with little catchphrases to make it kind of a bit, so it doesn't seem so serious all the time. So, things like I've seen teams saying things like, oh, I'm going to activate home mode now, rather than saying, kind of getting a bit antsy about it and saying I have to go home. It's, listen, I'll be in home mode, but it's okay if you want to give me a call. And so finding kind of a common ground and a common language, I think is a nice one as well, to help people kind of understand each other's boundaries.
I love that. And I love putting this in the context of ways of working, because there are so many things to consider. We're in a team. Like, there could be morning people versus evening people, like where you best spend your energy. There could be
100%.
people who really enjoy kind of being face to face and in the same place, and they can, or people that need like a bit of a buzz of a noise going on to do some deep thinking, or people that want to be buried away, be like me. I like to be buried away in the quiet. That helps me with my focus. And everyone is going to be different on that front. So I think talking about those differences and preferences, and kind of in some ways even a little bit celebrating the differences, because if we were all the same, we'd all be producing exactly the same work in exactly the same way. Like, nothing interesting or new would ever happen. I think that's a really positive way of talking about boundaries, is in this kind of context of ways of working. So I do have a question on that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I do the same thing with Jake, my husband, in terms of parenting?
Say more. Okay, in parenting terms.
Ways of parenting.
Say more about what you mean.
Like, so instead of sitting down and talking about, this is the way that I'm really great at working, this is the way that I'm really great at working, and how do we find that compromise? Like, this is the way that I'm really great at parenting. If I had to choose, that there has to be something in there somewhere. And this is how I would do it. But I guess you can use it in your personal life,
I think
as
so.
well.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to any kind of particular research on it or anything like that, but I know that it certainly works in a team context. And if you think about it, parenting is kind of like the ultimate teamwork, isn't it? So, yeah, I don't see why not. I always laugh at Brené Brown has this thing where she talks about herself and her husband, and they have this thing where they give each other a score out of 100. Like, so they give themselves a score out of 100, and they're, if their energy levels are 20, then it's up to the other person to go, you know what, I got you. But I always laugh at that, because I'm like, but hold on. What if we're both at 20, or what if we're both at 10, or, which often happens, doesn't it? We're all sick, or we're all something's, but I do think it's where I kind of like the advice, because it speaks to that idea of, you've got to communicate with one another within in a team, or in a partnership, or in a, in a marriage, to make sure that you're both working at your best, and that you can do your best work as parents. You're doing what works best for you, I suppose. Because, like, there's certain things, and I think actually, now that you say it, there's probably things that I am good at when it comes to the kids that maybe Dad isn't so good at. And there's definitely things that he's really good at that I'm not good at. Like, he's much better at cooking than I am. And I think we sort of have already got that subconscious agreement, you'll take that, I'll take this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this gets into the whole sort of mental load discussion as well, which is an ongoing.
Yeah, are we ready to go there yet? I'm not
We're
sure.
ready to go but that, definitely communicating and getting specific about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, and what you want to do, and what, where your energy lies, and all of that is definitely the start of the answer on that.
And actually, maybe that's a nice conversation. Maybe I'll kind of integrate that in terms of where our energy levels are. My only fear with that is, whoever goes first, the other one might say I say to Jake, where are your energy levels today? He's like, oh, they're really low, they're at 20. I might be like, yeah, well, I'm at like 18. So if you could just change over.
Yeah. You've got 2% on me, buddy.
You got 2% on me. Do you remember, did you ever have this when the kids were little? Like, sleep competitions, who'd had the most sleep in the night.
Oh,
so
yeah.
You'd wake up and be like, I was up twice last night. Well, I was up once, but the whole time I was up for an hour, because they wouldn't go back to sleep. And then I was up 3 times the night before. And then actually I went to bed late because I did the last feed. Like, we'd get into this whole battle about who had the most sleep. And in reality, no one had enough sleep. That was what the
No.
issue was.
And you were all feeling terrible.
We were all
None of-
feeling
yeah.
terrible. I mean, that is
Yeah.
the haze, isn't it? As I look back
I
at those
know.
days, I think, how do we function? Okay, so I feel like this is really, really helpful. And I think I am also thinking about this in the context of having a little bit, even though I say, we try and get rid of judgment as much as possible here, I would actually like to add a little bit of judgment here in terms of time, energy, and focus, in that, is it what you want to be doing as well? So does it fit with your values? Does it fit with
Yes.
how you want your life to run? Does it? And I'm not saying I have all the answer to that right here. I think that's a whole discussion about kind of living a life that is made for us. And I think we should do a whole episode on that. But I just think that's something to think about as well when you're thinking about your boundaries. It's not just, I have to do this, I have to do that. Don't get me wrong, we all have that day in, day out. I've got a whole list of things I have to do every day, whether it's for me or for my work or for the children or, friends, family.
Mhm.
But actually, somewhere having a lens of, is that what I want to be doing as well? Is that setting me up in a life that I really enjoy? Which
Absolutely.
is definitely a whole conversation. So maybe we should
It
park that
is.
one and come back to it.
Let's park that, because I think that really speaks to a whole conversation around toxic productivity that we can really delve into. I think, when it comes to conversations around boundaries in the workplace, often the issue is not that people need to set boundaries. The issue is that there's way too much being expected of them. Why should people have to set boundaries in a world where they're being, there are far too many demands, and workload is way too heavy, and also some often unnecessary workload. That's the other problem. Anyway, so yes, so let's put a pin in that one and discuss it again. Should we mention the email address? Because
Did
if this
you just see
conversation has,
Did you see the shock on my face when you said that? It's like, oh
Yes.
yes,
yes,
mention
we
it.
remembered again. Because if this conversation, and we've only literally scraped the surface of this topic, but if this conversation has brought up anything that you want to ask us more about, or that, please do share any advice that you might have. Send it all into us at, okay, Gemma, it's hello@pitw.com. Is that right?
I don't know. We might have to skip this bit. Sorry. No, it's not. Leon, our producer, is telling us that is not the email address. So I don't know if the listeners are actually going to hear this bit, or if we'll be cutting this and weaving it in. But can you see the address now?
Yes. So
Okay,
the
go
email
then.
address is, in fact, hello@psychologyinthewild.com. It's not hard to remember. I don't know why we
know.
have a mental block, but I
Oh,
think
I
our
don't
mental
know.
load is so busy that there's certain things that are just never going to stick.
And I think we've had so many issues remembering this email address between us that
It's now
I get
become-
myself in a panic every time I have to think about it. But I'm going to stick a post-it on my my screen at some point. Okay, well, let's leave this conversation here. I'm sure this will be something else that we delve into at some point. And again, yeah, exactly as you say, if there's any questions, we've had a few questions actually from listeners that we can start delving into during these conversations. So hopefully we'll get more of that. We can, I don't know, answer some questions or add more questions to the list. Who knows? But until next time, Erin, stay safe in the wild.
Have a good one.